Hi there, this is Alan Stedham, Christian fiction author, with a new video I've been wanting to record for a while. This one is called The Armin, 10 Differences Between the Comics and the Novels. Now, the Armin, you might be wondering, who are they, what's that? As you might imagine, when I started the comic at 10 years old in 1980, it was pretty basic, but I had been influenced by various Marvel and DC comics by this point, and I really loved the X-Men. However, I was not writing a team of mutants. The Armin got their powers from different sources, and some of them didn't have powers. The Armin became an integral part of one of the stories in Mindfire, which was my first Christian fiction novel. Heads up, we are heading into spoiler territory if you have not read Mindfire. I'm going to point out the 10 main differences between what happened with the Armin in the comics and the version of the Armin that ended up in Mindfire and will be in my next work in progress, which is a Mindfire prequel called Unto Dust. There may be a few more books in the Mindfire series. Time will tell. Okay, so let's get into it. The Armin. 10 differences between the comics and the novels. Number 1. Malevolence. Who she was, her redemption, and her role in the comics. Okay, so Malevolence in Mindfire is a supervillain. She is Leia's biological mother, and she had a relationship with Steve Hamilton, who is the superhero called Crusader. That's very similar to the way things started out in the Armin comics, except that Angela Merrick, who became Malevolence in the novel, I gave her a different name because at the time I couldn't think of anything better. She was Cygirl, and Cygirl was a telepath and a telekinetic, and her powers, when she received them, drove her crazy. So again, that's a similarity. However, in the comics, she got her powers from basically an experimental ray from a mad scientist bad guy, and too complicated. So in the comics, not long after she gained her powers and became a villain, Crusader basically was on a mission to bring her back to the good guy side, to restore in her the good personality he knew her to be before she gained her powers. And he succeeded. They fell in love and they got married. She became Angela Hamilton, the wife of Steve Hamilton. They eventually had a daughter named Lee. Lee would become Leia in Mindfire. But a huge difference, between the comics and what I wrote in the Mindfire novel is that Angela, Cygirl, joined the Armin and essentially became the matriarch of the team. She stayed a good guy, and Steve Hamilton, Crusader, was obviously the patriarch of the team, and they were basically a power couple throughout the whole comic book series. And in the novel Mindfire, she stayed a supervillain and left and stayed out of their lives for 20 years until the events in the novel brought her literally back into the story. Number 2, Sue, the cat's whole story was different in the comics. Let me explain. Sue Sanchez did not always have cat powers. In fact, in the comics, she found a suit, a costume, that was actually deposited by aliens, because remember, I was 10 when I wrote this. And Crusader was already around, so she admired Crusader, and she became the Crusadess. Yeah, 10-year-old. Anyway, and she joined the Armin. The costume that gave her superpowers, when she had the costume on and she had a mask that was like Crusader's, she had super strength, could fly, speed, all that kind of stuff. Now, she did become the cat in the comics, but it was a side effect of using the superpowered costume that led to her developing the cat powers, and she had the cat powers going forward in the comics. Okay, so another thing that's very, very different in the comics is that she fell in love with another superhero on the team named Wildfire, who had the oh-so-clever real-life name of Will Defar. Will Defar, Wildfire, yeah, 10-year-old. So they got married, and they had a son named Billy. Number 3, Black Fox's origin and children. Okay, so I created Dana Fox in 1985, so she was relatively late to the party on becoming part of the Armin. She was also my first African-American character. She would also become the co-leader. In fact, she would become the leader of the Armin much later in the series, but her story was very, very different in the comics as well. She was a normal human woman. She was not a werefox like in the book Mindfire. She actually found a magic fox mask. Yeah, it seemed cool at the time. I don't know. And she never got involved with Silver Knight in the comics. She did in Mindfire, and in Mindfire she had Silver Knight's son, Dane, who became Shadow in Mindfire. Well, Dane and Shadow was around in the comics, but I decided to have Dana get involved with an alien prince named Rakon and have twins. So she had one son who was Dane, and another son who, honestly, I forgot his name, but he went by the name The Unknown. He was a bad guy and insane, and basically his whole purpose in life was to destroy his mother Dana and the Armin. And his powers were a little bit different than Dane's. They both could appear as silhouettes or shadows, but essentially The Unknown could shapeshift. And anyway, he wasn't a very likable character in the comics, and there was no reason to bring him over into the novels. So there was that. Another difference is that in the comics, Dana was plus sized, and when she put on the mask, she transformed into Black Fox, where she was not plus sized. I didn't really like the message that was sending by the time I got around to doing the Mindfire books, so I changed that so that in the books, in Mindfire, her backstory was that she was fat as a child, and that by the time her powers emerged, she had changed and she became basically a fitness buff, and that suited her character more. It made sense, and so that's the way it developed. Number 4, The Reign of the Armin. Comics versus novels. Okay, what do I mean by that? In the Armin comics, the Armin became a generational team. They had all their own stories. They got married. Some of them got married, had children, and their children grew up and were basically being primed to either be on the team or were already on the team. And so basically you had about 2 decades of time that passed in the comics, whereas in the Mindfire novel, the team only existed for about 3 years. And then the final confrontation with Killer Knight and the destruction of the Armin satellite, that led to the dissolving of the team, and only Black Fox remained active as a superhero. So huge difference there. But it made a lot more sense for the novel to keep it limited and give them their own story in the past. And that way it wasn't all about the capes and the costumes and the masks and the secret identities and all that stuff. I just wanted in the Mindfire novel to focus on, the here and now with Leia and her story. Number 5, Crusader, Superman wannabe. So in the comics, Crusader actually had 2 different origins. When it started off, he found, he and White Knight actually, they found costumes that were left by aliens. The only reason I can give for my 10-year-old self coming up with these ideas for how to introduce superheroes was that there was a television sitcom on at the time called The Greatest American Hero, and in that television show, aliens came and dropped off a red supersuit that a high school teacher found, and when he put it on, it gave him powers. I really enjoyed that show. I thought it was funny and everything, and it influenced my comics. But as time went on, and I saw that that didn't really make sense in the long run for these characters that I'd been writing for years by this point, I decided to revise at least Crusader's story so that it turns out in the comics that he was actually an alien and that he had been sent here from a world called Sagarathia. And it was pretty involved of an explanation. Basically, where he came from, magic was a big deal. And so his parents, who naturally were king and queen of that world because they used magic like everybody else. Well, when Steve was born on this world, he had powers pretty much from early on. And he did not have magical abilities, did not develop magical abilities, so he was considered a danger. And so he was sent away for his own good, his own protection, to another world that could support him, which of course would be Earth. Okay, that was not going to make it into the Mindfire novel. Way too complicated, way too unrelatable, and kings and queens? Okay. So yeah, that got dropped by the time the novels came around. 6. The absence of Starla. Okay, continuing off of the previous point, in the comics, once I established that Steve was from Sagarathia and from a royal family, he had a sister in this story as well. In fact, his sister came to Earth to find him. And once she did find him, she, of course, joined the Armin and fought with her magical powers along with the team. It was actually a pretty valuable member, but again, for the same reasons that I didn't include Steve as an alien, there was no need to have his alien sister along for the ride as well. Just too complicated. Number 7. The evil OP vampire sorceress. So, in about the first year and a half of when I created the Armin comics, I created a villain, and her name was Shanna the Vampiress. And Shanna was about 200 years old, but because she was undead, she hadn't aged since she died and came back as a vampire. But she was also a sorceress, and she was pretty deadly. As time went on, I developed her more as a character, and she became basically an arch nemesis for the team along with Killer Knight. They didn't work together though. Shanna was she was something else. And unfortunately, in the development of her character, she became more and more powerful to the point where she killed off the dark gods that she was serving and took their power for herself, becoming even more powerful. And although this made for fun and interesting story at the time, it was impossible. It was like a Thanos level character on steroids. So by the end of the series, it all came to a head, and no, there was no way to even consider bringing her into the books. It would have distracted from the entire point. Even to mention her would have distracted from the entire point of the story. So yeah, no Shanna. Number 8, the Cosmic 3, Cyclops, Medsnake, and Flamia. Okay, so these 3 characters were actually created by a friend of mine in high school? Yeah, in high school. And he basically did a little mini comic for them. He knew that I was doing comics, and when he lost interest in continuing with the characters, he offered for me to use them. So I did. But for obvious reasons, these 3 female characters who were sisters and Caucasian, Cyclops was the first to go. She just was obviously a tie-in to Cyclops from the X-Men, and I just couldn't do a lot with her character. It's just the name and the power was distracting. So she got dropped pretty quick. I did try to develop Medsnake and Flamia, and was pretty successful with that. Medsnake actually, in the comics, dated Silver Knight off and on, and Flamia was a pretty interesting character too. In the books, in Mindfire, however, I made them a lot more distinct. It was fun to make Medsnake Scottish and to make Flamia Asian American and give them their own distinct personalities and roles in the story, and it was a lot more satisfying using the characters in the novel. Number 9, Tanya was the older sister and a mom. Malevolence was immortal. So let me explain that. To try and deepen Angela's character, I did several things over the course of several issues, especially once we got around to about issue 140 of the Armin. And so I had a 20-something-year-old Tanya, who had never been seen before in the comics, tracked down Angela at her job at a university and explained to her that she discovered through records that Angela was her birth mother. And Angela's like, "No, I'm not. I don't remember you." Well, as it turns out, in the comics, I had it so that when Angela went insane, when her powers manifested and she became Cygirl, that she was pregnant, but she was pregnant with Tanya first and went off to have her. And then when Angela came back to the surface as the dominant personality after Crusader had helped her and pursued her and won her back to the good side, that Cygirl and Angela blocked the memory of that time. So basically, Angela did not remember her time as Cygirl. What she did, she knew what Crusader told her, but she did not remember. And so Tanya fell between the cracks and went into foster care and essentially became a young mother of twins in her teen years. Anyway, when she talked to Angela in the comics and brought these memories to the forefront, for reasons I have yet to figure out, this took Cygirl's power to the next level, and for some reason that also made her immortal and eternally young. Yeah, teenage logic? I have no idea. And so this set the course for Angela as Cygirl, who I would later change her name to Sanity, became more and more and more powerful. So there was somebody on the good guy's side to kind of match Shanna power level wise, but that created its own problem. Later on, number 10, Armin number 147, The Great Retcon. So I finished up the Armin's story initially in Giant Size Armin number 3 in the year 2000. It was essentially a final confrontation between Shanna, the vampiress, and Sanity. And technically it ended on a good note, but not really. It was a mess. I will not even go into the details of all of it because it would take quite a while to explain. But needless to say, when I did finish the series, I, by this point, had been kind of souring on doing superhero stuff and wanted to do, by this point, like I said, the Giant Size Armin number 3, I wrote it and drew it in the year 2000. In 1996, I became a Christian, and I started trying to write more Christian-oriented elements in the Armin stories, but it was clashing. So I decided to end the series on a way that I thought I wanted to, and it wasn't satisfying. I went on to do other things with my wife Angel. We would co-write the Due East webcomic and go through that and do some other things, but the way the Armin ended still bothered me. So in 2006, I said, okay, I'm going to write the ending I want to write for this. So we're going to do one final issue, one medium-sized issue. It was about 35 pages when I got done with it. And it started with a retcon. Essentially, after what had happened in Giant Size Armin number 3, Sanity decided that the ends did not justify the means, so the only way that she, with her power which had extended to essentially reality warping, I mean, she could do more or less whatever she wanted, plus she had the telepathy and the telekinesis, like I said, very, very overpowered. So I had her take herself out of the equation and go back in time and have herself to never reunite with Crusader, and instead to raise her daughter Tanya and leave it at that. Well, there were consequences. Anytime you change time in time travel, there's going to be unintended consequences, and that's what I did. That's what the title of Armin 147 was, unintended consequences. So the first thing we see is that Sue, the cat, wakes up next to Steve Hamilton and finds out they're married. She knows things have changed. She has kind of some leftover memories of the way things were before time got changed, but it's kind of hazy. And we find out that Black Fox has become a villain, and that, Lee, who had become Leia in Mindfire, Lee was actually the biological daughter of Sue and Steve, but that Tanya was still her older sister, half-sister, from Angela. Again, I'm going to try not to make this too complicated, but the long and short of it was that Armin 147 was a much better wrap-up of the storyline. It's also the first comic that I ever did bloopers for afterwards, but Armin 147 kind of set the stage. It was still 7 years before I would even begin an attempt at writing Mindfire for National Novel Writing Month. But the big change of having Steve and Sue, Crusader, and the cat be married and have a family and start from there, that was the big change. That was what I needed. And so even though things were different in the comics in terms of people's roles and what happened and how it ended up and everything, it was the springboard into what would become Mindfire. So I could go into a lot more, but those are the 10 biggest changes, the 10 biggest differences between the comics and Mindfire and Unto Dust, which is going to be the Mindfire prequel. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen in on this today. Please subscribe. If you liked this, like the video. If you subscribe, hit the notification bells so that you can get all the updates. I will be releasing more videos, and thank you so much. See you next time.